Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content. And before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yes, we are back at it again with another off-season review, and we're going to be doing the Atlanta Hawks and the San Antonio Spurs, right? So a little bit different from the last time. And we're going to start with the Atlanta Hawks, who had probably one of the best off-seasons in the league, right? We kind of went over them many times over the course of the year. We picked the under on them, and we ended up being wrong. Now, they ended up still not finishing with a great record, but a lot of that was because of the injuries sustained in the latter part of the season. But you look at their roster, and they were kind of seemingly able to get on the right track after kind of the disastrous era with the DeJounte Murray deal, right? Not necessarily all his fault, but it seemed like it just didn't work. The fit wasn't that great. We were both kind of on the side of don't need to trade Trae Young, just move DeJounte Murray, see what you can get. Didn't really know what they were going to get back from him. They got back Dyson Daniels, who ended up playing the best basketball of his career last season, right? Was all defense, most improved player. Had a great season for the Hawks as the full-time starting guard next to Trae Young, right? Basically giving him 14 and 6 with 4 assists, as well as 3 steals per game, leading the league, right? So he was a terror on defense, and offensively, right, his game picked up from what it was before, which was kind of the issue, right? Obviously, he still only shot 34% from 3. He had some hot and cold stretches, but, he's still very young, basically 21, 22 years of age, so he should get better. Jalen Johnson gave him 19 and 10 before he ended up getting hurt. He only played 36 games and pretty much improved every facet of his game on both ends of the floor, scoring, rebounding, assisting, 5 assists a game, defense, a block, and a steal and a half a game, right? Kind of one of their main defensive wings. They've had, more of a identity of putting some athletes and lengthy guys around Trae Young. You also had Reese Shea as a rookie come in and have a really solid and productive rookie season, right? 46 from the field, 36 from 3, 13 and 3. Not crazy numbers, but overall, just when they drafted him at the time, we were like, this is a guy that pretty much fits in pretty solidly to what the Hawks want to do, and as kind of a prototypical 3 and D wing, right? And that's kind of the identity that the Hawks have grabbed. And then Onyeka Okongwu beat out Capella for the starting center spot, right, to round out their starting 5. But in this offseason, right, they made some big moves. They ended up trading for Kristaps Porzingis, right? Didn't really give up much, basically Georges Niang. And Porzingis is in the last year of his deal, right? And he has been kind of up and down, right? Not necessarily in terms of production, but in terms of his health. He just has not played a ton of basketball for the Celtics in the last couple of seasons, right? And last year, he had the long stretch where it just seemed like he had an illness that he just could not get over. Played 42 games last year. Again, in the games he played, 20 and 7 a game, 41 from 3, right? But then in the playoffs, it's pretty disastrous, right? Only 21 minutes a game, shot 30% from the field, 15% from 3, only 8 points. Just not really sure what happened there. But, obviously the Celtics now are in the midst of basically a new era of Celtics basketball, right? Where they pretty much traded most of their team away. But the Hawks were able to get him for cheap. So if he's healthy and he's productive in a contract year, he could be really good for them, right? I'm curious to see whether or not he starts because Okongwu's been the starting center, but Porzingis has the bigger resume. He was just a part of a championship team as the starting big. So he might get the starting nod, but we'll have to see. I would think he does, but of course it could be Okongwu. But then after that, they also grabbed Nickeil Alexander-Walker, right, in the sign and trade from the Minnesota Timberwolves. Trade exception, right? So they didn't really have to give up much other than, I think, a second-round pick, right? But we know what we know what he did last year for the Minnesota Timberwolves. 3-and-D guard, can guard multiple positions, 1s, 2s, some 3s. And Trae Young recruited him, right? He wanted him to be a part of this group. And again, he fits into that identity that they're clearly trying to build. Luke Kennard brought in as a 3-point shooter, 1 year, $11 million deal. Again, a guy who can get hot and sometimes can kind of help you out, especially in the regular season, but not much of a defender. Pretty much there to space the floor, which is fine again because Atlanta needed some more 3-point shooting on their squad because again they have a few guys that are a little bit up and down from 3. they also drafted Asa Newell, right? And that was a draft pick where he was a guy that a lot of people really liked. Of course, they made that deal where they ended up trading with New Orleans, right? Where they will have New Orleans unprotected first round pick next year, right? In exchange for Asa Newell. And again, we saw him in the summer league. Initially, when we saw him play, he looked kind of raw, but as we saw more of him, right, then he kind of flashed a lot more of a well-rounded game, right, where he, is crashing the boards, he's knocking down shots, being a good athlete. So, and he's also got really good size, right? He's about 6'10". So, he's got like a really versatile skill set where if he pans out right, then he could be, a really good contributor for them, right? Is he going to be the starter? Probably not, just because of the forwards they already have. But, at a certain point, he's only 19. So yeah, I think down the line, he could be a really productive player for them. I mean, again, do you like him more than Derek Queen and the first round pick? I mean, again, it was kind of a no brainer once New Orleans offered the unprotected first. Where, because we don't know what New Orleans is going to be like next season. I mean, they could be okay, but they also may not be that great depending on all their questions with their health and everything else. So no issues with that for the Hawks. And, pretty much after that, then you're just kind of factoring in internal development from all the other young players that I mentioned, like Jalen Johnson, like Risa Shea, like Okongwu. And with Okongwu, you just kind of wonder, can he continue to progress his overall game, right? He started to flash a three-point shot last season. But, defensively, he's improved, right, a lot from what he was before. He's a good offensive rebounder, but just continue to improve from a skill standpoint. And then after that, you just kind of wonder with the Hawks, Trae Young. He was not offered an extension from the Atlanta Hawks, right? He's got this year and then a $48 million player option, right? And we're kind of wondering what's going to happen there, right? Is he going to sign and is he going to re-sign at some point? Maybe he opts out at the end of next season and signs a new contract. Or, do they part ways? I would think it would be more likely that he just resigns just because they've put this team around him. And, he's kind of he's a guy that puts you over the top. I know there were a lot of people who felt like Jalen Johnson was the best player on the Hawks last year because I know Trae Young didn't shoot particularly well, but he's the offensive engine. He makes everything go, right? Playing the point guard, distributing and scoring. He does a lot of he does a lot of the heavy lifting offensively for them. And I think their ceiling is lower without him. So if I'm the Hawks, I'm re-signing him, especially in this Eastern Conference, again, where with the Celtics and the Pacers being out of commission, you might as well go for it and see if you can potentially make a deep run again. We know Trae Young has kind of taken a beating in terms of his reputation the last few years, right? Because there's a lot of people that have kind of questioned, can you really win with this guy? Can you really be that good of a team if he's your best player? Because they went to the conference finals a few years ago, but they haven't done anything since, right? Other than a couple of first-round exits and a couple of missed postseasons, as we just saw this last year. I think both you and I are still really big fans of Trae Young and believe in how good he can be and that he's, one of the better players in this game. But again, he still has to go out, prove it to everyone else. And if he does that, then I think this relationship will continue and they'll be fine. And then they'll just be one of the better teams in the Eastern Conference. So I'd give them an A for the offseason. I think they have a really good core around these guys. I wouldn't pick them necessarily to come out of the East, but I think that they could get to the Eastern Conference Finals. And maybe if things pan out, maybe they go even further. But they should be, after the Cavs and the Knicks, they should be one of the top 4 teams in the Eastern Conference, especially if everything, continues to go their way. Because it feels like there's an upward trajectory with them. Because even though Trae Young is, 26, that's still a relatively young age, right? He still hasn't necessarily hit his quote-unquote peak yet. And then all the other guys are younger than him, aside from like a Porzingis. So why not assume those guys are going to get better in the ways that we mentioned? So I think that this is going to be a really strong year for them.
Yeah, I agree with you. This was a 40-win team last year, and I think with the additions that they've made, all across the board, right, from from the top to the bottom, right. I think that's going to net them a lot of wins in this upcoming season. And with the vacancy of the Eastern Conference, I think they're pretty much primed for an automatic playoff spot. Finally getting out of that play-in territory. And the young core is, I think, what really matters, right. like you said, Trae Young, 26, still counts a part of the young core. But Jalen Johnson, I think that injury last year for sure derailed everything that they had going for them. Because if you watch just a little bit of Atlanta Hawks basketball, you know how good that guy was going to potentially be, come the end of the season. But here we are. The wing depth, I think, is pretty good. Like I talked about, Jalen Johnson, awesome. And then you have a guy like Zachary Ricochet, who I think, people probably have pretty big expectations for in year 2, right? What does he look like? Does he get more efficient? Because he did all the little things correctly, I think, last year, and all the right things, that you want to see from a rookie, right? Didn't really struggle. Was pretty consistent. So, and definitely got better towards the end of the season. So, expecting some big things from him. Dyson Daniels, being the perfect complement, I think, to Trae Young, right? That's a guy that you can, put on the opposing team's best player, right? He's going to get you stops. He's going to net you steals. And offensively, he's not a guy that you could sag off of anymore, right? And I think this will be year 4 for him, I think, or something like that. So that's another guy who's a part of their young core, right? So it's kind of crazy that New Orleans, did give up on him fairly early. But regardless, right? There's a lot of positives, I think, for this team, right? And, getting Porzingis, that helps too. And that was so low cost, right? Like, you can't even fault them if it doesn't work out. And you do have a Kongu as well. So the big man depth is pretty good too, right? I get it. You lost, Clint Capella, you lost Larry Nance Jr., but I think bringing in a guy like Porzingis offensively, in a perfect world, Trae Young and Porzingis is pretty much a match made in heaven, right? That's a guy who could stretch the floor. Exactly. That's a guy who could stretch the floor, but also play down low if need be. And we already know that Trae Young can maximize the best, out of his teammates as well, with his playmaking and what he's able to do. So for sure, underrated playmaker, Trae Young, that is. So I think the overall adjective that I would use for this rebuild or, retool, I would say, is definitely underrated. The Atlanta Hawks are going to be underrated. They have been for the past couple of years. They just never really, figured out the little things. But it seems like there's a true identity here, right? You're surrounding a guy, Trae Young, who's not really the strongest defender at all, but is such a great offensive hub and can be that playmaking guy with so many defenders and versatile guys, right? And that continues when you bring in a guy like Nickeil Alexander-Walker. We already know what he can do. He can pretty much be Dyson Daniels light. So that's where I think I have to give them an A as well. There's nothing really wrong. And you look at what they lost, I think the gains definitely outweigh the losses here. Like, yeah, I'm sure it stings to lose Clint Capella. But like I said, bringing in a guy like Kristaps Porzingis on a low risk, high reward move is phenomenal. So I kind of just have to hand it to them. And like you said, like you also said, Asa Newell, that's the other young guy that they brought in as well. So not too many high expectations for him, but if he can crack the roster or the rotation, then that's just another hit.
Yeah, because that's the thing with Porzingis is, again, it gives them a skill set from a big that they didn't really have. Because I mentioned a Kongu shooting more threes, but he's still not necessarily like a great elite 3-point shooter for a big, right? He's improved, but teams are going to be still more comfortable with leaving him open and daring him to continue to be more comfortable with that since it's a newer skill set he's acquired. But with Porzingis, that's what he does for a living, right? He's a guy who's a very good 3-point shooting big, and like you mentioned, that's going to open up the floor for all these other guys, right, who are not as strong of 3-point shooters. Like, that opens the floor for Dyson Daniels or Jalen Johnson or even like a Trae Young, right, who we know can get hot from 3, but again, is not like a 40+% 3-point shooter, right? We know he likes to get into the lane with his floaters. And we know he can kind of fool you into thinking he will go up with it and then pass out of it, right? He's one of those, tricky type of offensive players to slow down. So I think the key here is that you have more versatility and you have a little bit more optimization for what you can do with all these guys. And, like you said, you want to kind of make the game as easy as possible for your best players. And, like you said, and like I said, I think they did a really good job in doing so without having to give up anything significant. Because again, they didn't have to give up multiple picks. They didn't have to give up any of their, prized young players. It was really just basically expiring contracts. I mean, again, you gave up Georges Niang to get Porzingis. Cost is low because of his injury history and his lack of availability. But if he pans out, right, that's going to be a real success, a real underrated trade, just given the fact what they gave up. And then, but the main thing for them is again, how do their young players progress? If Jalen Johnson can get to that all-star plus level, right? That's where the Hawks can be potentially the best versions of themselves, right? Because we already know that Trae Young at his best, is an all-star plus all NBA level guy. But Jalen Johnson, right, in the games that he really showed that, like, hey, if he was healthy, he may have been able to crack the all-star spot. But just if he can be healthy and continue to be better and productive, and like I said, be all-star for sure in this Eastern Conference, don't know if he'll be all NBA, but if he can at least be, like I said, close to being an unquestioned all-star or better, right? That's just going to put the Hawks in so much of a better position to get out of the East, as opposed to just kind of banking on some things going their way. And that's the thing, is they are kind of in that tier a little bit where you do need some things to go your way to be the best possible version of this team. But as we've already said, and as we've said with all the Eastern Conference teams, with the Eastern Conference being in flux, right? There's like there you have a little bit more room for error, right? Because we know there's always going to be teams that end up underperforming and teams that overperform. And like you said, the Hawks have slid into that underrated tier now, because again, when they first did the DeJounte Murray move, or before they did that, it kind of felt like the Hawks were teetering towards being just flat out bad, right? Because everybody talked about the changes in the front office, um, and whatnot, and some of the guys that were replaced, and you're kind of wondering, like, okay, is this team gonna be like a serious team, or are they just gonna kind of move everything out and then trade Trae Young and everything else? And they actually, again, they shut us up and showed that, like, yeah, no, we actually know what we're doing. We're going to move DeJounte Murray and take a flyer on Dyson Daniels, who I think a lot of people, ourselves included, liked, but he never got a whole lot of playing time. So a lot of it was just kind of in theory on paper, right? But again, as I already said, and as you said, right, with the added opportunity, he took advantage of it. And again, looks like a really, really promising, defensive minded guy in this league, right? Who now has added to his offensive game. So, like you said, the Hawks definitely belong in that Eastern Conference contender tier. Maybe not necessarily tier one, because I think most people just are going to be higher on the Cavs and the Knicks in general, just because we've seen more from them as of late. But the Hawks have, the potential to move up because of, like we said, the young core. And that's what kind of separates them from some of these other teams, because say like a team like Milwaukee, their best player is obviously better. Giannis is a significantly better player than Trae Young, but just the supporting cast for the Hawks is a lot better, and there's just more upside, where chances are maybe they might be able to survive. Not, you still need them to play, but you could survive maybe Trae Young being out for a little bit, as long as the other guys continue to play well. And again, just there's more upside with all those guys. Whereas with the Bucks, if Giannis has to miss significant time, you're pretty much done anyways. I mean, if any of your best players have to miss time, that's already a problem. But I just think there's more to this Hawks roster in terms of the depth and the young talent, which it seems like you just kind of have to have. It's just kind of hard to be able to get through the 82 game grind regular season without young guys that can get you through, that can play with energy and play with motor. And the Bucks don't have a lot of that. Along with some of those other teams in the lower tier of the Eastern Conference, right? Not to just necessarily specifically pick on them, because I know we've gotten some comments lately, but just as a whole, right? The Hawks feel like they have a higher, potential ceiling. But again, I still wouldn't put them in tier one, because I think everything has to go right for them in a way that I don't think you have to ask as much out of Cleveland and New York. But the Hawks could still definitely be an Eastern Conference finalist team, because, they will have to probably take out one of those two teams. And, they've shown they can compete with both of those teams, in fairness, because, last season, before Jalen Johnson went down, right, they were one of the few teams that beat the Cavs multiple times. I mean, like, I think they beat them 2 or 3 times in the regular season. The Knicks, the matchup was a little bit different, but as we talked about, regular season matchups don't necessarily mean a whole lot. But, and also for the Cavs, most of that was prior to the Hunter trade. But the thought process was the Hawks have the wing advantage compared to Cleveland. And that's where you could have some problems where, okay, you could put their wings on Cleveland's backcourt, and they still have other bigs and other guys at different sizes to kind of battle with Cleveland's bigs, right? So that could be a matchup that could be in their favor. And then, for the Knicks, right, just last year, until the latter part of the season, they weren't as strong defensively. And so a guy like a Trae Young, who's a quick, guard, not like a crazy athlete, but he's got a lot of quickness to him, right? Could eat them alive in the pick and roll. With him, with Towns and the other guys they have. So I think even if I wouldn't pick them as a tier 1 team, I do think they match up very well and could beat those teams in a 7-game series. But like I said, everything has to go right. And that's kind of where you look at their over-under. Their over-under is 46.5. Now, last year, like you said, they were basically, a slightly under 500 team, right? They won 38 games last year. But a lot of that was due to injuries. So if you're high on the young core like we are, if you're high on Trae Young like we are, and if you're high on what they can be in the Eastern Conference, I think you got to go with the over on this one. So
Yeah,
that's what I would do.
yeah, it's a no-brainer. Like I said, with all the moves, top to bottom, I think it'll net them at least 5 or 6 wins. So that puts them right at the over.
Yeah, and I'm also anticipating like a Jalen Johnson will play more than 36 games. So,
yeah, and he's gonna fry the league. That's the funny part. Like he's gonna be amazing. So
right. So that's what I would do. So as a whole, everybody's high on the Hawks offseason by and large. We're high on it too. We think they can be really good. It's just a matter of, again, I just need to see what some of those other pieces look like and whether or not they can be healthy, just because we haven't seen as much of that just yet. But
yeah,
if it all pans out, like I said, this could be a really good year for the Hawks.
yeah.
So, yeah. So moving on, let us know your thoughts in the comments about the Hawks offseason and whether or not you think they could be a real threat in the Eastern Conference, like we do. So now we're moving on to different team. We're going to move on to the San Antonio Spurs, right, in the Western Conference, right, where they are another team, not quite like the Hawks, but they're another team that's gotten a lot of buzz over the summer. Of course, the highlight of their offseason, right, was the move to bring in Dylan Harper, right, who's Ron Harper's son. But, of course, everything initially begins with Wemby and then also the De'Aaron Fox trade that they made at the trade deadline, right? We didn't really get to see much of those two guys together. Really only played in about 5 or 6 games before Wemby had the blood clots. Before Wemby had the blood clots, right, he was playing at an All-NBA Defensive Player of the Year level, right? 24 and 11, 4 assists, 3.6 blocks, so leading the league in, 3.8 blocks, right, leading the league in blocks by a decent percentage. His 3-point percentage got better. His free throw attempts got better, right? Just overall, really strong season. He started off kind of slow, right? But again, the starting 5 was a little bit different. And it was just, again, it was the beginning of the season, kind of factor in. Sometimes guys might get to slow starts, but pretty much from, the what, 5th or 6th game in, from that point on, he was playing like a monster. And we said kind of one of the keys for the Spurs is how good does Wemby get quickly? Because if he all of a sudden just progresses to top 10 guy, like he kind of was last year, then that all of a sudden raises the floor and the ceiling for the Spurs as a real team in this conference. So I'm curious to see what they do with that duo, because again, we saw so little of it. But this summer they did sign Fox to the extension. So, assuming that everything goes right, that's going to be their future, duo pairing, which, I think could have some really good results from it, as long as Fox, continues to be a decent 3-point shooter, right? Where he's been kind of spotty at different points. But aside from that, again, the highlight of their summer in the draft was Dylan Harper. They drafted 2 guys that I think we're both pretty high on, him and Carter Bryant. We'll start with Dylan Harper. We saw both of them in the summer league in Las Vegas. And with Harper, you're obviously a huge fan of him. You actually liked him more than just about any guy in this draft for the most part. But when you watched him, you could see a lot of the strengths, right? He's a great athlete. He can run the floor. He's got really good size and length, plays hard, plays smart. Only question is mainly the jumper, right? Because his jumper's been kind of spotty, been kind of up and down, and you don't really want that for a guard. But if it can get to a decent level, like if he can just be average, then that opens up everything for him, because he can score off the dribble. He's got a really good handle. He's a very explosive guy, got a quick first step, can get to the rim, can get to the free throw line. So I think, like you said, just a lot of what you would want from kind of a modern day guard, he's got, just aside from the jump shooting. Even defensively, again, he's playing with effort. And it just would be, I feel like it'd be tough to not do that, on a team with Wemby. I know sometimes when you have a guy that's that good defensively, it can kind of allow you to be like, well, I can take this play off knowing that Wemby's got it at the rim. But just as a whole, I think he's going to bring the best defensively out of just about everyone in that group. So, I think both of us are high on him. I'm curious to see whether or not he starts or whether or not he just plays a lot because they already kind of have, guys that ranked ahead of him. And, if you start him, then it kind of gets tricky in terms of figuring out, all right, who starts, who comes off the bench. Fox and Wemby will definitely be in the starting five. That's a given. Just a matter of, does he start with them? Do they start Devin Vassell? Because Vassell's already under the big contract. So you imagine he starts. Then just the question is, okay, also you got Stephon Castle, right, who was Rookie of the Year last year, right? That's another guy that you have to kind of factor in. But he's a guy that can kind of play multiple positions, right? Because, again, he's another guy where his jump shot is not particularly great, but he's a great athlete. He's got size and length and can guard multiple positions. So there's potential for them to put out some really tricky athletic defensive lineups that are going to be really tough to score on just because they have so much size and length at multiple positions. Jeremy Sohan, he's in year 4. His role's kind of vacillated a lot, so I don't really know what they're going to do with him. At times, it seems like they don't love the fit, mainly on the offensive end, and then other times, in certain lineups, they do. Just kind of tricky, but again, with the Spurs, we talked about it. The reason why you don't push for a Durant trade, it's not because he's not good. It's more so just if you're the Spurs, you're not there yet. You need to see more of what you have, and you definitely wouldn't give up the opportunity to take Dylan Harper, for any of that. So just overall, I'm just very curious to see how they fit in so many of these guys because they do have a lot of guys that I do have questions about from a 3-point shooting standpoint, and they're all probably going to have to play because they're all good. Carter Bryant, that's another guy we like, where if you watched him in Summer League, he already profiles to be a really terrific defender. I mean, he plays hard. He uses his length, uses his size very effectively. And just overall, just as a pest, right? Just a guy who can guard a bunch of positions and just is a really aggressive defender. But again, the type of defender that you want on your team. You want a guy that plays with effort. Again, sometimes that aggressiveness can be used as, a weakness where, like, okay, if you overplay a guy defensively, that can be a negative. But just as a whole, you're starting off from such a great point that I'm not really worried or concerned about any of that. It's more so just, can he knock down the 3-point shot? Can he hit corner threes? Can he cut back door and get easy baskets? Could he, crash the boards, get some easy opportunities for extra possessions? All the little things, like we kind of mentioned with some of the guys in Atlanta, and I think he can do all of that. So I think he'll be able to slide in and get minutes right away because he's already got a really good NBA skill set on the defensive end. And that should be a guy that should be in your rotation. Of course, they have some other guys that have been there for a while. Keldon Johnson has been there forever, one of their longer tenured players. Kind of had an interesting career turn, right? Because for a while he was kind of a starter and looked at as sort of like a revelation, right? Because I don't think as many people were crazy high on him. And, he was able to turn that into a contract, decent contract. But in the last couple of seasons, he's morphed into more of a 6-man role. So now, it looks like he's probably going to be less and less likely to be part of their future core, right? Where it seemed like he was going to be that for a while. But, regardless, he's a guy that worst case scenario can come off the bench and give you some good offensive possessions. The fun doesn't stop there, though, because they continue to make some other moves. Of course, they acquired Lindy Waters. Don't have to spend a whole lot of time on that. But either way, they also brought in for bigs, for extra big man reinforcements, Kelly Olynyk and Luke Kornet. Kelly Olynyk they got from the Wizards, right? They traded, I believe, Malachi Branham, right? As well as, I think, one of their other guards who didn't really play a whole lot for them. But, and the Wizards ended up
Blake Wesley.
that guy.
I think it was Blake Wesley
Yeah,
or something like that.
yeah, Blake Wesley, exactly, yeah. But I think the Wizards waived him. So really, they mainly got back Malachi. But Kelly Olynyk, veteran guy, been in the league for a while, can space the floor as a big, decent passer, gives him some extra size, gives him some extra front court depth. But then they also signed Luke Kornet away from the Celtics, right? This was a 4-year deal, but only the first 2 years are guaranteed. And this was one of those contracts where we didn't know all of that when he was first signed. So it sounded kind of wild just because of a 4-year deal for a guy who's 30. But only the first 2 years being guaranteed, he was a part of that Celtics team that's been in contention for the last few years. Really good shot blocker, smart player, takes up a lot of space, good around the basket. Again, just another strong defensive option. And again, with Wemby's ability to space the floor, you could have some crazy two big lineups with that, right? You could put both of those guys at the 4 and the 5 and have Wemby act as more floor spacer that can also block shots and kind of switch out sometimes. Not that you want Wemby guarding a ton of guards, but just with his length and his IQ, just he can sometimes hold his own in those spots. So they did a lot really in order to kind of reinforce the Wemby foundation for this team, again, by adding some front court depth, by making smart moves in the draft, by adding a defensive-minded wing in Carter Bryant. I mean, they're another team that I think really had a strong offseason. Again, there were always questions about were they going to trade for a star, but I don't feel like that they needed to rush and do that. And for now, right, I kind of like what they really did here. So this is another team that I'd probably give out an A to, just because, again, I think that they made a lot of moves. I like a lot of the players they brought in, and I think this team has the potential to be a really sneaky team, right? Like, they're probably not going to be as good as, like the other team we just mentioned, the Hawks, because because the Western Conference is a lot tougher than the Eastern Conference. But this is a team where, especially, again, if Wemby continues to improve and progress, they could really challenge and, potentially mess around and knock one of these other teams out in the play-in and have a real chance to maybe get a playoff spot. I don't think that they're a top 8 team necessarily, but again, if all goes right, they could be in the mix. And, that's a scary thought because, again, at a certain point, once you get another year or so from now, this could be one of those teams that could be running the league in a little bit. They're not there yet because we still have to figure out what they are. But so far, so good. I like a lot of what I've seen from them recently.
Yeah, it's really, I think, crazy to talk about this team, especially, in the recent years, like what they've been able to accomplish, right? It all starts with Wemby, but, for this offseason, I think it starts with the draft. Bringing in a guy like Dylan Harper and Carter Bryant, I mean, that's automatically a win in the draft in my books, right? Because you got pretty much, the best stopper in that draft class, and then arguably one of the best offensive talents that the league potentially has ever seen in Dylan Harper, right? Like, this is a guy who has comparisons to Cade Cunningham and Jalen Brunson combined, right? So we'll see, what that looks like in the league. But, overall, just wow, like what an offseason that they had, right? And then on top of the fact that, you paid Fox and locked him up long term, that's amazing, right? And I know some people are like, yeah, like, why would you give Fox that type of money? The playoff, numbers aren't great, not a lot of experience, but in my opinion, I think, you went out to get the guy for a bargain, and that's why people liked it. But, we all saw the contract extension coming, and we all knew the amount of money that was going to be doled out here. So I don't know why it came as a surprise. So I love it. I think we do need to slow our roll, and I'm glad that you talked about it, right? They're not ready yet. Like, some people are like, yeah, this team is going to be, automatic, 8 seed. They're going to be amazing, yada, yada, yada. But it's like, I think with this roster, the talent is there, the raw talent is there, but the growing pains are going to be there as well. And I think we do have to account for that. Like, granted, yeah, they were the 34-win team last year, but now you're exactly. But now you're adding in a lot of guys into the mix that there might not be a lot of space for, right? Like, offensively, how are you going to scheme, Dylan Harper into a system where you already have a guy like Devin Vassell who needs to take shots. You have a guy like Wemby who's obviously the centerpiece, and you have Fox who's also a scorer. Like, those guys aren't table setters, right? And I think you kind of saw that with Stephon Castle. He kind of struggled offensively at times. Like, what is his role offensively as well? So I think they're going to need to figure some things out, and that's where the growing pains are going to come from in terms of figuring out who's who, what's what, and what works and what definitely doesn't. And I think the stuff that doesn't work might stand out a little bit more than the stuff that does work, outside of the Wemby factor, right? Like, I think everybody's expecting Wemby to progress and be better and better each year. But it's going to be the other guys, I think, that have more pressure on them, right? Like, how does Sohan develop next to Wemby even further? If he can, who knows, right? Does Carter Bryant slot in and take Sohan's spot? I don't know. But overall, you have a plethora of talent, and I don't think you can fault them for that. But I do want to lower people's expectations with this team. I don't think they're going to be the greatest team of all time. They can be down the line for sure. That's a lot of talent. But for this season, let's just slow our roll. Let's watch them work. But you do have to applaud the fact that they brought in so many guys. And like you talked about, the big man depth is awesome because you're clearly protecting Wemby, right? You're giving him, versatile backups in Luke Cornett and Kelly Olynyk. So, yeah, shout out to the Spurs, bro. They had a great offseason. I give them an A.
Yeah, and that's the thing that we kind of talked about that you alluded that I was discussing, right, is the fact that, like, yeah, you don't want to necessarily automatically pencil them in for a top 8 spot because there are questions about the roster, especially in terms of, like you said, how do these young guys progress and the fit? Because I kind of already hinted at it. There's a lot of guys on this roster, and you pointed out that there are guys that need the ball. There's a lot of guys on this roster that are not necessarily great outside shooters. And that's the other tricky part as well. Because I already mentioned Harper, right, who we don't know what he's going to look like as a rookie, as a three-point shooter in the league. But then also Stephon Castle, right, who, again, we all liked last year, but we don't know what his jumper is going to look like as of right now, right? Like, it's still a work in progress where teams are going to be more than comfortable leaving him open. Even a guy like Fox, right, who we've seen him get hot, but he is a streaky three-point shooter, and most teams more so guard him inside the three-point line, right? Like the mid-range area and in is kind of where he operates at his best. And then even after that, right? Like Sohan's improved as a three-point shooter, but still a guy that teams are going to leave open. And, that's just kind of a theme of a lot of the players on the roster where, again, are all those guys going to all improve their three-point shots in the course of one summer? Maybe, but, some of those guys I think are a little bit further away from being that anyways.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of where offensively it could be tricky. But defensively, I think is kind of the area of the floor where you kind of expect the Spurs to be really tough to score on. Again, there's a lot of young players. Young players have the reputation of, just not necessarily knowing a lot of the different defensive concepts and schemes in the NBA, right? Even though they have a lot of athletes, they haven't played a whole lot of basketball yet together. So that's where there's going to still be moments, like you said, where there's going to be growing pains. And that's where it's hard to really just automatically, like you said, pencil them in as a top 8 seed, a 47-plus win team. Again, of course, there's ways that it can go right because, like I said, if Wemby progresses and he's basically like close to a top 5 player, then yeah, like they could potentially really challenge and knock some teams out and be a lot better than people expect. But, again, I feel like it'll probably be somewhere in the middle where, again, they're going to be better for sure. And if Wemby's healthy, they'll definitely be better. And that's kind of, I think, where some other people are coming from. Where they're like, hey, like you said, they won 34 games, with Wemby only playing in 46 of them, right? So they found some ways to win even with him out.
Mm-hmm.
But either way, I don't think that they're going to be a 50-win team. But that's kind of where that leads us to the over-under. So I'll kind of let you start. Their over-under, according to all the places that we picked up, 43.5. So what do you think? Are you kind of in the over-under realm? Because that's a tricky one.
Yeah.
Because, again, talking about 8-9 wins better, which is feasible. But could they be better than that? What do you think?
I'm going under. I think they're probably around a 500 team. Like, it wouldn't surprise me if they go like 40 and something, right? Like, I think that's probably what their ceiling is realistically. I think they're going to be probably a 40-win team. 43, I think, is a lot to ask in this conference, right? If they were in the East, no question, right? But I think there's going to be health issues. I think there's going to be stretches where they probably can't shoot at all, and I think that's going to probably be a problem, especially late in games. So there might be times when, they might lose a lot of close games, and I think that's going to come back to bite them, especially in the final win total. So I'm going under on this one.
Yeah, I think I'll go a slight under, and I'll go at like 42 because again, I know that if people are going to make the case of, well, if you're as high on all those guys together and if you're high on Wemby, why not go over? I'm just kind of being conservative, and like you said, that's the tricky part with over-under. Sometimes you have to kind of weigh some other things beyond just the talent as a whole. And like you said, we're envisioning that there's going to be stretches where it's going to be tricky for them. And in the Western Conference, it's really difficult to have long stretches of not being great and then also finishing, in that 45-plus win tier. That's the part that I think is going to be tricky, for them. And again, they got better, but there were also other teams in the Western Conference that got better that were already better than them. So that's kind of where I'm factoring in, like, where, if they're going to be close to 50 wins, if they're going to get to like 46, 47, right, where are those wins going to come from? Now, you could say they just come from a bunch of the Eastern Conference teams, but still, I think they would need to do relatively okay against a lot of the Western Conference teams to get there because they're going to play all of them at least 4 times, 3-4 times, depending on who they play in the NBA Cup, which, I need to go back and look at that. But just either way, even if it's like 42 wins, it doesn't sound like that's great. But just from where they were a couple seasons ago, where they were one of the worst teams in the league, that's a major improvement in the Western Conference, right? Because we're not talking about, a team improving 10 games better, but they're in the East where there's a lot of mediocre teams. I mean, in the Western Conference, how many teams can you look at and just say, yeah, that's a lock to be a bad team? Probably only like 2 or 3, if that. That pretty much means that there's going to be at least 10, 12 teams that are all, at least early on, going to try to make the case of, hey, let's go on and try to make the play-in or the playoffs. Now, as the season goes on, there's going to be teams that are going to be like, oh, well, we weren't actually as good as what we thought, so maybe we'll just cut our losses. Happens every year. But if I'm the Spurs, again, you're definitely looking to be better, but I'm not quite sure that they have enough to automatically like pencil them to be in that upper tier, because I just think compared to some of the other teams, there's just more guys that I have questions. Not that I don't like them, but just I need to see more of them together as a group. And that's kind of where I'm not quite ready to just automatically say, like, yeah, they're going to be, one of the, better. Because again, if you're talking about like 45, 47 wins, you're pretty much penciling them in as like a top 6, 7, 8 team. And I'm just not quite there yet, because I would need to see one of those other teams get knocked off. But
Right.
I guess let's say they get in,
Okay.
right? So they would have to jump over, at least a handful of teams. And I guess the question is, like, could you see them jumping over, like, let's say Memphis, Dallas, some teams are like in that tier, right? Because those are probably the teams that are going to be closer to the play-in, right? Because most of the top 6 teams will probably stay top 6 unless, something happens in terms of injuries, right?
Yeah, I could see them jumping Dallas maybe. Just because I think the problem with Dallas is I don't know where offense is really going to come from for that team. Right? Like I'm sure we'll get to them at some point in the summer, but I think there's going to be growing pains with that team and Cooper Flag and what they look like offensively, but defensively they're going to probably be in a similar tier as San Antonio, but Memphis, that's another tough one because I think defensively they're going to be pretty stellar as well. It's just offensively, what are they going to look like because you did lose Desmond Bane. So I think all 3 of those teams are kind of in the same awkward conundrum of having probably a very good defense, very versatile, but offensively there's probably going to be some growing pains.
Yeah, I think they could be better than Sacramento.
Oh yeah, easily.
Yeah, and
no brainer.
And Memphis. I think Dallas might be the trickier one. And like you said, even though Dallas is going to be without Kyrie, they do have other players that are a little bit more proven, and I could see them, and they, again, know he's been kind of a meme now, but I mean, they did bring in D'Angelo Russell, right? Who with Anthony Davis, and Clay and all those other guys. Like I think you build, at least of right now, I think you could build a little bit credible offensive group. Even though again, it won't probably be amazing, but I think they have more proven guys where I could see them being better. And then you have Kyrie coming back at some point, presumably, right? And so that's already going to be your big addition because he wouldn't have played in a while, right? But definitely, I think Sacramento and Memphis they could pass. It's just a matter of once you get past that point, I'm just not sure. And again, either way, right, that still puts you in that play-in spot where, yeah, they could get out of the play-in, but I just think I wouldn't automatically bank on it. But if they can get to the play-in, that's an improvement and that's a successful season. I would say if you're the San Antonio Spurs, they're not a team that is in a rush to win the championship or be a contender right now. They're a team where, like I said, and like you said, they're in the rebuild and they have to continue to develop these young guys and see what they have. And I don't think it's the worst thing in the world if they don't make the playoffs again. But you definitely don't want to see them take a step back and then be close to the same or worse, right? Like you don't want them to be a 30-something win team again, like 35 or under. Like you don't want that. If they can get to around 40 wins, so if they can get close to that over under and be a fixture or a potential threat in the play-in, that's good enough for me.
I agree with you.
Yeah, so again, let us know your thoughts in the comments about where you see the Spurs, what you like about the offseason. Maybe we're too low on them because, again, with Wemby, maybe anything is possible, but I still need to see the rest of the roster continue to progress before I automatically just kind of put them in that mix with all the other teams. But if it all pans out, they could do it. But I think, like you said, more than likely, there'll probably be a little bit of a mix somewhere in the middle.
Yep.
Yeah, so moving on, not really a whole lot at this stage, right? Again, I mean, we still have the Kuminga stuff going on, so we're still kind of waiting for that. We did have an NBA trade, but a relatively minor one, right? Haywood Highsmith going to the Brooklyn Nets, right? Really just kind of the Nets just kind of doing what they've been doing as of late, where they're using their cap space, but not really using it to bring in any, crazy guys. I mean, he's not really making a lot of money. I mean, again, Highsmith is an okay player, right? He's a decent shooter, plays hard, decent defender. I remember because Draymond pointed it out, right? Reportedly, before they moved on from Butler, right? They were going to bring Butler off the bench in favor of Highsmith. I don't know how much truth there actually is to that, but that was something that was reported. But either way, just something that's kind of funny, and I'm curious to see if the Nets do anything else at this point. Probably not a whole lot, but just like a minor trade. Don't really have to spend a whole lot of time on it. Just
Yeah,
not a
nothing
whole
crazy.
lot's happened since since we've been since the last time we met.
Yeah, nothing crazy by any means, but you
Yeah,
can't hate on it.
yeah. I will say you did have the Raptors announce before we got on, right? That Bobby Webster's contract as GM is going to be extended, but they still don't have a president of basketball operations because that's the team that got rid of Masai Ujiri, not bringing him back. So they're kind of moving on, doing a new thing. So, we'll see what happens with the Raptors, and we'll get to them eventually, right? Because we haven't done them yet, and we'll talk about their offseason because they're kind of an interesting team again as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. After that, I guess we'll kind of go into, the usual thing that we do where we kind of go into our polls and comments and whatnot. We really, it's kind of funny because since the Bucks won, it's been pretty quiet, but we did actually have a comment on our IG, right? Because again, we also go on Instagram and we do those polls, right, where we discuss and kind of ask questions for people and to kind of figure out what's going on. And we asked the question of, will the Grizzlies make the playoffs? And this one was a 50-50 for all of our responses, which again, I think kind of does encapsulate what's going on with the Grizzlies right now, where it's like you said, they lost Desmond Bane. They did bring in, KCP as a vet, and they did bring some guys in the draft, but the situation does still feel like a retooling where you feel like the Grizzlies are probably going to take a step back, and they're not. And whereas last year, most people were pretty high on them and felt like this is a almost lock to make the playoffs. Now it feels like they're probably teetering towards playing again, but maybe not quite as confident that they're just going to be in the play-in and in the playoffs like last year.
Yeah, they're probably gonna have to fight. And I think that makes sense, right? And that's what you would kind of expect when you lose, one of your guys of your big three. So, and like we talked about, you have to weigh it, right? They got a ton of assets. They got a lot of flexibility that they can use down the line to potentially make the team a crap ton better than what it was in, the more recent years. And I think they just realized, all right, the three of these guys can't win anything together. Simple as that.
Yeah, and especially with the new CBA.
Yeah,
That's the part that makes it trickier as well, which kind of leads us into the comment that was left from us on IG from 2X Tims. And he asked the question, do you guys think they gave up Desmond because he was delaying what Ja Morant could be? Because not going to lie, it kind of seems like they were trying to build around Ja, and Desmond was erupting into the first option. And he was taking on ball handling and playmaking duties at times, which was always Ja Morant's job. I feel like that has to be the reason because they had a solid team with good depth. Why mess it up unless you feel like one player has the ball more than you want your star player to have the ball?
Well,
And
what's up? Go ahead.
yeah, and I did respond, and I kind of said some of what we were already talking about how, yeah, like it's a lot of it's due to the CBA. You can't pay all those guys at one time, and maybe there's an argument to the idea of put the ball in Ja's hands more, but I it's hard for me to make the case that they're going to be better than they were before because you have less talent now. So I don't necessarily think that it was mainly because of like Desmond Bane taken away from Ja Morant. I think it was more so a financial ish reason, and they were getting back a lot of picks too. So it's like a team came to them about Bane, gave him an offer, and gave him an offer that they couldn't refuse, and then they took it. Right? Like I don't think they would have just automatically just, all right, we're putting Desmond Bane on the trade block. Any takers? Right? I think the magic came to them and we're like, we want to get better. Here's our offer. We're willing to give you X, Y, and Z. And also, again, with the new CBA, you have to factor that into. So I think it was more so that. But I know some people have made the argument of, well, now we get to see Ja with the ball in his hands even more, which again, he's at his best with the ball in his hands. But, again, I still feel like it's a team with a lower ceiling because you do need that extra, decision making, which Bane gave you. But again, like you said, they probably kind of came to the conclusion we weren't going to win with all three of these guys making max money. So we're going to have to pivot off of one of them. And Bane was probably the one that you do it.
Yeah, well, also, I agree with the guy somewhat, but at the same time, I think there's irrefutable evidence that Ja didn't really play a whole lot in the past couple of seasons too. So that's the other thing, right? So of course, Desmond Bane is gonna continue to progress when Ja Morant only played 9 games in 2024 and then 50 in 2025. So I think there is that as well. But I think with Desmond Bane leaving, I think you'll probably see a more ball dominant Ja.
Yeah, and that's the thing. So I do kind of agree with some of what he said. Like you said, like they probably want Ja to have the ball in his hands even more. But at the same time, like you said with Desmond Bane, his improvements as a ball handler, playmaker, decision maker also came on the heels of Ja being pretty consistently. And you would have needed Desmond Bane to do that anyway if you wanted to be the best version of Memphis. Because I just don't think you can have a team where Ja has the ball in his hands like with almost as high of a usage rate as just about anybody, and you're going to be, one of the best teams in the league. Because he's not quite that caliber of player where you want that, right? Like it's wild because when we first did this podcast, he was considered by and large near consensus top 10 guy, right? Like almost everybody had him in the top 10. But now, right, like he's, most people have him out of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where, now he's kind of in that tier where it's like, yeah, he could still be all NBA, all-star, but he's not like consensus top 10 anymore, right? Which basically puts him like closer to like 20 than 10.
Yeah.
And, again, you would need him to get back to that first anyways to have a real chance at being able to do something. And, again, he's still young, so that could happen, but it won't come without him being healthy. But I do think, like he said, I think he made some decent points about, the ball being in Ja's hands. I just don't necessarily think it was because they felt like, oh, Desmond Bane's got the ball in his hands too much, and now this fit doesn't work as well anymore.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so, well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, if you want to join in on these discussions, always leave comments on our shorts and videos. You can leave comments on any of our socials, any of our posts, because we always go over these IG polls every episode, and continue to like and subscribe because our channel is growing. Seems like everybody likes the content we're putting out. So as long as you guys keep doing that, we're going to continue to do what we're doing. So we appreciate all the support. Thanks for all of it, and we'll see you next episode.